All right, so good evening and welcome to the webinar from the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust. We are very excited this evening to host Alexandra Zapruder, the editor of Salvaged Pages. Before we get started, let me just introduce a couple of people and to kind of set some parameters for what we need to do, and then we're just going to get right to it so we can hear from Alex as she tells us all about the impact of Diaries of Young People in the Holocaust. So my name is Laurie Schaefer, and I'm a member of the council, and I'm the one that sent you all the emails. So hello and welcome. Also, we have a couple of other people from the council here, including Lee Holder and Karen Claich and Amy Clark and Lauren Piner. And we also have Mike Abramson, who is the chair of the council. Mike, I want you to say hi and any kind of words of inspiration you got.
Hello, everyone. We are so excited to have Alex Zapruder with us tonight. I've been looking forward to this, and I do hope you get something out of it and let us know how we're doing. And we're excited about our curriculum that we've rolled out, and we're training teachers on it. So a lot of good things are happening in this troubled times. So there are bad things going on in the world, but the council is trying its best to counter that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, so a couple of things as you come in. It would really help us if you could kind of make sure that the name on your box is your name. If you have like a fun nickname or something like that, that's great. But we would like to know who you are. We also like take attendance so that we can actually give CEU certificates. So that would be truly helpful if you could do that. If you are able, we would love for you to keep your cameras on. We understand if you've got things going on at home, you just don't want in the background. I have 4 young children myself, so I totally understand. But if you can, it really helps, I think, to be able to connect with people. Also, please make sure you are muted so that we don't have any of that background noise either. As we progress through the webinar, if you think of questions as Alex is presenting, please feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll be curating them and taking them all together and doing a Q&A session at the end. So it sometimes helps if you're thinking of it right away to go ahead and put it in there so you don't forget to ask that really interesting question. We'll also be sharing some resources with you where you can connect and maybe do some other things in Holocaust education in our state. We know we have people from all over the country joining us today, actually, not just in North Carolina. So welcome to everybody outside of North Carolina as well. And we also have another member of the council, Linda Moss is there. Okay, cool. Awesome. So we have lots of people here. We actually had a record number of people register for this webinar, so we're very excited to get started. Other than that, I think I just want to introduce Alex to you. I've actually heard her present many times in person at the Holocaust Museum and have always enjoyed hearing her perspective of how Salvaged Pages came together and the impact that it has, as well as other projects that have resulted from it. So I guess without further ado, Alex, I'm going to let you kind of take over here
Okay.
and go for it.
Thank you so much, Lori. Thanks, Mike and Amy and Karen and Lee and Lauren and all of you who made it possible for me to be here this evening. I'm just so glad to be with you all. I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. It is cold, 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 cold in Washington and rainy. Going to be snowy, I think, soon. So if you want to just pop in the chat where you're from and say hello, that would be lovely. I see a couple of faces of people that I know. I see Liz. Hi, Liz. Always nice to see new faces and old friends. So I thought what I would do is just start by talking a little bit kind of in broad terms about Salvaged Pages, about this project to collect diaries of teenagers. This book is now over 20 years old. It's had an amazing life in education, much different from anything that I ever could have expected or anticipated at the time that I began the work. And I thought I would start by just talking a little bit about how it came to be and what motivated this effort to collect these diaries, and then what the work yielded over time. So I'll try to offer you some broad frameworks for thinking about it, and then I will share a couple of diary entries with you, hopefully, if we can do it, We'll have a little bit of back and forth. It's always a little tricky on Zoom, but we'll do our best. And then I'll share some resources with you, and we'll have time for Q&A. So I began my work as a student of the Holocaust back in the early 1990s. I had graduated from Smith College, where I did my BA rather in art history and French literature. And I came back to Washington, D.C., which is my hometown, and I got a job at the Holocaust Museum, which at that time was not yet open to the public. It was still was still in the early years of being created. And I was hired initially to work on an exhibition about Varian Fry, who some of you who teach the Holocaust may know who Varian Fry was. I was hired because I was fluent in French at the time and I had an art history background, and Varian Fry had carried out this rescue operation in the southern part of France, mostly artists and intellectuals and musicians and other people who were sort of leading lights in German culture, who had sought refuge in France and were trying to escape to freedom. But very shortly after my first couple of months of working on that project, it became clear that there was no one to do the research for Remember the Children, Daniel's Story, which was the museum's exhibition for young visitors. And since I was the newest person on the staff, I was sort of plucked out of one job and plunked into the other job and told, now you're researching, now you're working on Remember the Children, Daniel's Story. And I didn't know anything about the Holocaust. I had never taken a single class about the Holocaust at all in anywhere in high school or college. But I had fairly strong research skills. And so I was sort of sent, and I always like to tell people that because it is kind of a lesson. It's something that I always feel is good to share with students. Sometimes you land in a situation, and if you are able to grab hold of it, it changes the whole course of your life. And it's not necessarily what I thought I was going to do or what I would have chosen at the time, but it led to all good things. So I was asked to research the lives of young people during the Holocaust as we created this exhibition, Remember the Children. And one of the most important things that I was asked to do was to have a look at diaries that had been written by teenagers at the time. And this was because, for some of you may have seen the exhibition or have learned about it through various sources, the exhibition is told through a diary that the curatorial team wrote. And so we wanted to look at real diaries of real teenagers to get a sense of how they express themselves and what kinds of things they wrote about. So I went to the museum's library and I asked the librarian what existed on the subject of young people's diaries. And at the time, in addition to Anne Frank's diary, of course, there were about 6 or 7, maybe 8 diaries that had been written by teenagers, translated into English and published, most of them in single editions, but some of them were in anthologies. And I took these back to my office and I started reading them. And I had just this very, very powerful, visceral reaction to this material. I had never read anything like it. I felt like I started reading these diaries and immediately I could just see that there was such a difference in the voices of one writer versus another writer. And the kinds of things that they wrote about were so varied and so thoughtful and complex. And there was so much depth and so much insight and so many unexpected observations that I just was completely mesmerized by them. And at the time, I was in my early 20s, and I remember thinking to myself, how is it that, as a fairly well-educated person, I went to a very good high school. I went to religious school all the way through. Not only did I go to religious school, but I taught in the religious school at my synagogue, and I had gone to a very good college. And I had never in all my years even thought that there was anybody else who kept a diary as a young person during the Holocaust other than Anne Frank. It never occurred to me that there was anyone other than Anne Frank. And the surprise of that, I think, was really significant for me. It made me think, how is it that for, a fairly kind of commonplace thought that there must have been other young people who were writing had just never crossed my mind. There was one diary, it was Anne Frank. There was one child, there was Anne Frank, that was it. And when I read these other diaries, I felt that they were so insightful and so interesting that it was really very sad that um, I didn't know about them, and that these diaries were all out of print. You couldn't find them in a bookstore. And why it was just seemed very, very unfortunate that it was as if Anne Frank's fame had almost eclipsed all of these other writings. And so at the time I thought, oh, well, maybe I'll just see if I can do a little collection of them, or, see what if I can do something with it. And because I was at the Holocaust Museum in this very kind of productive moment where a lot of things were happening, I thought, well, I'll just, as long as I'm doing this work on Remember the Children, I'll also see if I can find any diaries, other diaries written by teenagers besides the handful that I knew about. So that's how the research started. And, sometimes when you start doing research, you realize fairly quickly that there's just not that much. You're just not going to find that much. And sometimes when you do research, you realize very quickly that there's a lot more than you ever expected. And that was very much what happened with Salvaged Pages. I started to research this subject. I started to ask around. I started to read. I started to just keep a list of names of young people who kept diaries, whose names came up in the literature or among scholars or in oral testimonies. And that list grew from 8 to 12 to 15 to 18 to 20. And suddenly I thought, oh, this is really something. And if I'm going to be serious about it and really delve into this material, I'm going to have to, organize my thoughts and organize my life in such a way that I can really contend with this material. The work took a long time. It took 10 years to do the research that eventually resulted in Salvaged Pages. And I think there are sort of two counterpoints, ways of thinking about it. One is for me to begin by talking a little bit about the great diversity of the material, the range of it, which is kind of extraordinary. And then to try to help you think about what kinds of categories does it fall into? What are the ways in which you can organize this vast amount of material in your mind, and for many of you in your classrooms. So the material comes from nearly every country in Europe. There are writers who wrote in nearly every language in Europe there. And now, since Salvaged Pages, there are other diaries that have surfaced. For example, there's material from Greece that I couldn't find anything when Salvaged Pages came out. But in the last 20 years, there have been diaries of teenagers that have surfaced. So almost every country you can imagine. Writers who were as young as 12, and as old as 22, sort of that is kind of the bracket for what I consider to be youth diaries. There are, of course, diaries of young people who were in their mid-20s or older, but most of those really at a certain point, they're not young, they're not like teenagers, they're not young people in that same way. Many of them are in romantic relationships. Sometimes they're married or have children, or so they're sort of moved out of the category, even if they're still only 23 or 24. There are diaries from young people whose parents are all along the political spectrum. In terms of their religious practice, it could be young people who were from very religious Orthodox Jewish families to all the way to Peter Feigl, whose diary was written. He was a boy who was converted to Catholicism by his parents, so born Jewish and converted to Catholicism. A number of young people who were children of mixed marriages. And then a lot of children, probably the most diaries, are written by young people who were sort of culturally identified with Judaism, or ethnically identified, or identified through community, but not necessarily strong religiously practicing Jews. So there's a great range and spectrum there. The same can be said for almost any other the size of their family's wealth, whether they were urban or living in rural areas, you know, just on across every spectrum you could think of, there always turned up something new. You know, every time I thought I could make a generalization, this is sort of the kind of person who would keep a diary, something would surface over here that would blow a hole in that theory. And so I started to think, you know, the best way to think about this material is to not try to generalize about it, because there's no telling. And even along the lines of sort of literary gift or a level of intellectual engagement, you might think, oh, you know, writing a diary is self-selective, and so, you know, you'd have like kind of the best and brightest, or the kids who are the most you know, intellectually curious, or the best well-read. But that's not the case. There are young people who kept diaries who were, you know, didn't have much of an education at all, or who struggled a lot with language, or who wrote in very rudimentary ways, because there's something about that gesture, that need to document the experiences, that overrode um, even education and literary ability in a lot of cases. And that was certainly a big surprise. So as I began to contend with this body of material, which fairly quickly, you know, started to run into the thousands of pages, I thought, you know, what are the ways that I can break this down and impose some kind of structure on it so that it can be grappled with. And I'm going to offer a few of those frameworks for you, because I think, again, they can be very helpful in the classroom, and they can be helpful, you know, in just reading salvaged pages or looking at other diaries of other teenagers in the Holocaust. In particular, for this body of material, they break down across three broad categories of historical experience. So there are young people who were writing as refugees. So these are young people typically writing in Germany, Austria, or the Czech lands, and typically in the late 1930s, maybe 1940, but not much past 1940, trying to get out and flee, generally speaking, westward towards America, England on the Kindertransport, or Palestine. That's quite a broad category of young people. And these are young people who typically were very often separated from their parents and their family, very often sent alone somewhere, who were really writing about the experience of displacement, loss of culture, language, family, home, being transplanted into a new environment, adapting to that new environment, and all of the attributes and characteristics that go with the refugee experience. And I find that, in particular, for teachers who have populations of children or young people who come from immigrant backgrounds, who are recent arrivals to this country, or even not so recent arrivals to this country, that these diaries are very potent for these kinds of students, because they see themselves in these stories, even though the geography is different and the circumstances are different. There's something fundamental about being made to leave your native country and going somewhere new, something about the precariousness of the journey itself, and then the difficulty of adapting and learning how to live in a new place, that cuts across historical experiences. The other second really broad category are young people who went into hiding in one form or another. So these are, of course, the, you know, the Anne Franks of the world. These are young people, and there's kind of two versions of them. The more common is literal hiding, like Anne Frank. So somebody's in a bunker, someone's in an attic, someone's in the forest and outside in the Czech lands, someone is literally physically concealed from the outside world. And then there's another version where a young person is passing as a non-Jew, so with false identity papers, and somehow still out in the open and having some proximity to the real world, but concealing their identity with their false papers. And these diary entries are really about, whereas refugee diaries are about displacement, these are diaries about concealing identity, about deception, about hiding who you are, physically or metaphorically having to hide who you, literally and symbolically hiding who you are. And that is a very important theme, in particular as it relates to adolescence, which I'll talk about in a minute, that comes up in these diaries. So young writers document the mechanics of hiding and how they survived or how they endured, but also the experience of having to suppress and suppress one's physical place in the world and live as if you do not exist, which is, from an existential standpoint, complicated, to say the least. And in particular for adolescents who are just in their first effort to form an identity and declare their identity and become present in the world, to have to, at that particular moment, kind of fight that and hide that is something that is enormously complex. And then there are all the others who are typically young people living and writing in ghettos, in transit to ghettos, labor camps, in some cases living in occupied Poland or occupied parts of the Soviet Union, who are directly under the heel of the Nazi regime, with no mediating element. They're in this universe of Nazism, and they are moving toward extermination, essentially. They are somewhere along that path. And the majority of those are written in ghettos. And the life of the ghetto is, in and of itself, a very interesting and complex social structure. And so journals written by teenagers in ghettos tend to capture the isolation of being cut off from the rest of the world, the sort of loss of normal life, fear, separation, enormous deprivation, hunger, cold, very difficult living conditions, work, all of this kind of thing. But they also sometimes include a cultural life and a social life, because people could live in ghettos for years on end. And there were places where there was a kind of life that did emerge out of that place, even though it was precarious and temporary. So those are the three kind of broad historical circumstances that are reflected in diaries of this period. As teachers, I think what's important to say is that these diaries, at least, and I think you could probably say this about almost any diary, they are, one of the things that makes them so enormously useful for teachers is that they are both historical sources and literary sources at the same time. And there aren't that many things that are both of those things at the same time. So as historical sources, they're primary sources, right? We can mine them for the lived experience of the person who's writing, the detail, the texture of daily life. How did it seem as it was being lived? Not with the retrospective knowledge, not always with complete understanding of, or even accurate understanding of their circumstances, but what did it look like and feel like to be inside that moment as it was happening? And for teenagers, your students, that's pretty rare, to be able to get transported into the past and even temporarily sort of see a historical event through the eyes of a corollary, someone who's their own age and living without knowing what is going to happen the next day, the next week, or the next year. At the same time, they're also literary sources. Every writer, whether they were a good writer or not a good writer, whether they were ambitious and sort of had literary ambitions, or whether they were very modest in their efforts, used language to communicate something about their lived experience, whether it was for themselves, for their loved ones, for posterity, and the range of reasons why young people wrote is very broad. But they all share this effort to put language around some aspect of the human experience. And in this case, to put language around an enormously extreme human experience, the extreme deprivation, suffering, fear, identity-based persecution. And so I think one of the things that's very strong about that for you as teachers, in particular for the literature teachers and writing teachers, is this idea that, you don't have to be a great writer to create a record that matters about your life. And I really encourage the use of both the literary geniuses in this collection and also the regular writers, because, sometimes you just want to see how somebody experienced their life and how they described their life, not necessarily in this enormously kind of like, flowery or ambitious way, but just how someone documented their experiences from day to day to day. And that is what every writer did in his or her own way. And then the other thing that I think is particularly important about this and really worth thinking about is that, and it's something that I think students understand and gravitate to, is that every one of these diaries sort of, there's a unique voice of the writer, and it can't be confused with another writer's voice. People sound different. Their use of language is different. Their preoccupations are different. Their interests are different. Their tone is different. Their vocabulary is different. Their syntax is different. Every writer has his or her own voice, just like every person has his or her own voice. And for your students, there is something about embracing what has survived of that individual life that I think really drives home what happens in war and genocide. That, it's so easy to lose sight of that when we start talking about thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people. But when you read even 3 diary entries and you see how different they are, you begin to approach again this like really fundamental idea that these are individual human beings whose lives were shaped and ultimately in many cases destroyed because of in this case the Holocaust. So I want to say a word about adolescence, and then I'm gonna take a breath. And if you have a question, sort of, if there are any questions that are coming up now that feel like they should be answered before we get into looking at some diary entries, I'm happy to like pause and do that. So Lori, I'll let you say if you think there are things. I want to just say a word about adolescence. So I don't need to tell you all what it's like to work with adolescents and what the nature of adolescence is. I mean, it's one of the things that makes it always an enormous pleasure for me to speak with teachers, because teachers know that, just like parents know, that what young people are doing in this particular moment in life, sort of as they get into their teen years, is beginning to construct a self, right? They're thinking about, what have I inherited? What's coming from my parents? What's coming from my culture? What's coming from my religion, my nationality, my own family, my friends? And what am I absorbing? What am I accepting? What am I rejecting? How am I constructing and building my own personhood out of what has been given to me, what is being handed to me? And for these, that is a developmental process that is non-negotiable. That is something that we all go through. Every person who comes up in the world goes through that. That's like what happens as part of growing up. And it doesn't not happen just because you're living during a war or genocide or some other kind of international crisis or atrocity. It still has to happen. It just happens against the backdrop of something else. And so the experience of adolescence is enormously layered for these writers. And one of the things that I think is it's important to say, you could ask, and I was asked many times, like, well, what is it about young writers that is interesting? Why aren't they just the same as adult writers? Young people are not the same as adults. Once you reach a certain stage of life, your identity is more or less fixed. Yes, we change. Of course, we grow. Lots of things happen to us, but there are certain building blocks and basic elements of our personas that we've sorted out. And of course, teenagers that's not where they are. And so for young people who are engaged in that project of building their identity, even if they don't know that that's what they're doing, because most of the time they don't know that that's what they're doing, when they are doing that against the backdrop of a context in which one part of their identity is a mortal threat to their existence, in this case, their Jewishness, you begin to see how young people can grapple with that part of their identity. They might embrace it, they might reject it, they might fight against the way that their family's moral code is organized because, and this is a diary that we may have time to look at, for example, in a circumstance of enormous deprivation and hunger, there's certain rules of the family that are shaped by the circumstances. But the young adolescent writer fights that just the way that a young adolescent would fight the rules of the family in any home anywhere in the world. Um, and then when you add to that something like being in hiding or being held, but not being able to go to school, not being able to have a normal social life, missing parents, losing friends, all of these things begin to play into the construction of adolescent identity in a very particular way in these diaries. And it's something I think that's always worth being on the lookout for because, this is something that makes this body of material just enormously unique and very different from adult diarists who are typically writing about their circumstances, but not necessarily writing about themselves in the same kind of way. So with that, Lori, just if there's I don't know if there are any questions that are cropping up that seem like
We have a couple.
Yep.
So one question is, you mentioned the number of diaries that have surfaced since Salvaged Pages was published. Were most of those diaries that have been held by the diarist family? Is it other sources and things like that that have come about?
Yeah, great question. So by the time Salvaged Pages came out, there were about 55 diaries that I knew of that are either included or excerpted or mentioned in the book. By now, I think it's closer to 100 or 120. There's a lot of material that has come out. Some of it, I should say, there are diaries of Jewish teenagers who were writing as Jewish victims of the Holocaust. And then there are writers who were victims of the war. So like very recently, so these are kind of adjacent sources. Fairly recently, there was a large book published of 35 diaries kept by Russian teenagers in World War II. And of those, 14 of them were written during the siege of Leningrad. So that body of material really has grown, and they're not all Jewish teenagers. Some of them are young people writing in World War II in all kinds of different circumstances, but I think of them as being related. In terms of where they were and are and where they came from, at the time that I was doing the research, I would say there were still a lot of diaries held by survivors in the 1990s and into the 2000s. There were, diaries that people, grown children discovered a diary that belonged to a parent in an attic that they never knew existed and that sort of thing. By now, most of the surviving material has made its way to archives or museums. Although there are still things that are being found, and there's still things that are being found in archives and museums. Sometimes archives and museums have, material that has been sort of left untouched. and somebody comes around and finds it, and it's really just been sitting there the whole time, but no one had any reason to look at it or pay attention to it. So it really, they come from all over, but by this time, most of the material is in archival sources, from archival sources.
One other question, kind of a couple of people have asked is, like, are there ways to actually access some of those other diaries as well? One, you said you mentioned some from Greece, and we have a teacher who actually teaches at a Greek school.
Oh, fantastic. Great.
So like, are those accessible? Have they been published? I mean, I know you haven't, but in general,
Yeah.
I think that's what the
So,
question is.
so the Greek, well, let me say generally, the way that I handled this in Salvaged Pages was that in addition to the diaries that are excerpted in the book, there's an appendix at the back of the book that includes a paragraph or two about every diary that I knew of at the time that the second edition came out, which was in 2015. So you can what the easiest way at the moment to find out if there's something that is not in Salvaged Pages that you might want to use is to look in the appendix to the book. If the book was published in any language, I included that information. But there's also new material that has come out since the 2015 edition. And there is a Greek diary. I cannot think of the name of it right now. So whoever it is, maybe that person can, from the Greek school, can just email me through my website and give me a chance to look through my information and see what I can find. But I'm hoping, one of the big projects that I would like to do that probably will take a few more years to get off the ground is to create a digital archive of youth journals, not just Holocaust era, but youth journals throughout history. I've been collecting and gathering material for a long time now, and I think that there is a use for this. If you had, there are diaries of young people who wrote in Japanese American internment camps. There is a girl who wrote a diary in Japan during the war as a Japanese teenager. There are diaries from the Civil War. There are diaries kept by girls who were abducted by Boko Haram. There are diaries from Bosnia. There are diaries from all over, all different, and not only times of crisis and war, but also, Edna St. Vincent Millay kept a diary as a teenager, and Teddy Roosevelt kept a diary as a teenager. And, there's a lot of youth journals out there that, if you could pull them together and use them for educational purposes, I think there would be a lot of use and a lot of interest in that. So it's something I'm working on, but I'm going to need time and millions and millions of dollars to make it happen. So to be continued on that.
Awesome. So we've got a couple more, but I think they'd be good for near at the
At
end
the
because
end? Okay,
they have really good questions, but about like application and things like that. And I think those
great.
questions might be answered when you share some of the diary entries.
Great. So I'm gonna do that now. We'll start by, I want to share, because in North Carolina, I know that the Diary of Klaus Langer, which is the first diary in Salvaged Pages, has been adopted for 7th grade, and also, Lori, you said for 11th?
We've used excerpts from him also in 11th. Yes.
11. So I'm gonna share a diary entry by Klaus Langer. It's a very good diary to know about because it is a great point of entry. And one of the reasons why it's a great point of entry is because it was written in Germany in the late 1930s. It's sort of doesn't start with 1933, so you don't get the kind of very beginning, but one of the first very dramatic sets of entries is from Kristallnacht. So it describes a personal account of this watershed moment, which I'm sure is a moment that many of you teach in your classes. And then the diary really, in addition to being about the restrictions against Jews and the ways in which Jews were systematically excluded um, from German life, it's really about the experience of being a refugee, of trying to get out, of emigration, trying to legally emigrate, in legally in quotes, emigrate from Nazi Germany. And there's a lot to say about this, but I think the best way to begin is for me to share my screen and to show what I think I'll do is, let's see. No, doesn't it want to? Oh, here we go. So Klaus was 14 years old when he started writing in his diary. This is a picture of him with his mother. He was an only child. And I think it's important to I'm going to just say a couple things about Klaus before we read this entry together. Klaus was from a highly assimilated, highly acculturated German Jewish family. His father was a judge in the civil service. They had lots of non-Jewish friends. They were upper middle class. They took nice vacations. He was extremely well educated. He played music. You know, they were sort of the archetypal German Jews. And I'm sure you all know this, but I think given what's happening in America right now, I think it's really important to just take a moment to kind of talk about the anti-Semitism that underpins the events of the Holocaust. So you know that there were only 500,000 Jews in Germany at the time that the Nazis took power. And one of the most important tropes about that sort of is an underpinning of anti-Semitism is that a small group of Jews have a disproportionate amount of power, conspiratorial power against the broader society, and are secretly running everything from the banks to the media to international commerce. And so Klaus and his family are a classic example of a family who didn't see anti-Semitism anywhere on the horizon. They lived completely, up until a certain point, they lived in a society where they felt completely German, completely accepted. And yet there was this kind of this undercurrent of anti-Semitism that, of course, the Nazis embraced, and that then became dominant when the Nazis took power in Germany. And I just think it's important to say that, because sometimes we don't always make that explicit connection between, you know, what it was that was sort of the core of anti-Semitism and how it found expression against individual people in Nazi Germany. So the family lived through Kristallnacht. His father, the Reichspogromnacht, which is the other term that's often used. The father was arrested, and then, like many thousands of German Jewish men and boys, he was released on the condition that he and his family emigrate from Germany. Because, as we know, the goal at this stage of the anti-Semitism directed at Jews was to get Jews to leave Nazi Germany. So first it was emigration. That was the first step in the plan. And then when that didn't work, obviously the sinister plans against the Jews escalated. So I'm going to read this entry out loud. And I'm going to ask you to do what I think you can do with your students, which is simply to notice what kind of jumps out at you. What do you notice? What catches your eye? What raises a question? What raises a thought? Anything. There's no right or wrong answer to this. And then I'm going to ask you, I'm going to come back to the screen so that I can see you and ask you to share what you've noticed and try to kind of lead you in a discussion about it, to try to get at some of what is underneath the surface in this particular entry. So this is, what is the date of this? I can't see it because my thing is covering it. December 19th, 1938. Regarding the emigration of my parents, I have the following to report. First came 2 refusals from Argentina for lack of letters of credit. The rich uncle in America is unable to assume such a financial responsibility. We don't have an affidavit for the US. India requires firm employment there or a contract. Father is now trying to make connections in India to obtain a contract. He also wrote to Peru when he was told to go to the Uruguayan consulate. Allegedly, the Dominican Republic would take 10,000 Jews and provide them with visas. However, nothing further is known about that. It probably makes no sense to turn to them. However, with a Dominican Republic visa, it is possible to get a half-year visa for Palestine. Shanghai also accepts Jews even without a visa, but it is questionable how one can live there. The mail also brought no news from Palestine. We had submitted a request for a commercial certification. So I'm just going to start by asking, what do you notice? And Lori, are you able to see everyone and or maybe I should go, let me turn off this share screen so that we can see people, because otherwise I don't know how we'll call on people. Did anybody notice anything that they want to share, and what could monitor the chat too? But you can also turn off your, you can unmute if you want to and actually speak. Oh yeah, Stephen Hancock.
So one of the things I noticed from that is it seemed like every country made it difficult for people to emigrate out of Germany at the time to anywhere in especially the United States. And this reminds me of the story where that one transport that carried hundreds of Jews was not allowed into the United States, and most of those people were not able to get in and had to go back to where they'd come from, and most of them ended up in the concentration and extermination camps. So
yes,
that is
St. Louis.
Yes, that is one thing. It reminded me that, we think, well, why didn't they just flee? Well, this shows how difficult it was. Almost no country wanted any of them to come to there, and that's kind of one of the great tragedies of this.
Yes.
It's not the question of, well, why didn't they just flee? Nobody wanted them. And that's
right. So that's
tragic.
great. That's a great observation. And I think it's really important that what you said about, why didn't they just leave, which is, I'm sure, as you all know, a very common question that kids have. Why didn't they just leave? And I always think, the operative word in that sentence is just, because the implication, the belief, the wish is that there was a simple answer to this and they didn't take it. That would be a much easier thing to contend with than the reality, which is to really sit with the possibility that a person could be in a situation where there is nowhere to go, where they have tried every single option. And you see in this entry, this whole list of different countries, each one with its specific restrictions and rules and regulations. And this connects back to anti-Semitism too, because, anti-Semitism wasn't just in Nazi Germany. So what were the Germans doing? What were the Nazis doing? Their goal was to get rid of the Jews, get them out of Nazi Germany, and impoverish them, take all of their money before they left, right? Not just leaving. You can't leave with your money. You leave, but we are going to impose an enormously high flight tax on you. We are going to take all of your property. We are going to, you're going to leave impoverished. You will not leave with German capital, essentially. But then, and this is where the very important Avian conference, I think, is an important historical moment that you can kind of align with an entry like this. So you have the Avian conference where these representatives from countries gathered in Avian, France, to discuss the refugee problem that was being created by the German persecution of the Jews and the push for Jews to be forced out of Nazi Germany. And as we know, country after country after country, the representatives stood up and said, we cannot increase our quotas. We cannot relax our regulations. We cannot make it easier for Jews to come into our country. That is an example of a major historical event that trickles down into this individual diary. This is the result on a personal level of something that happened that was an international event. And you can see this direct connection. And so for your students to be able to read about the Evian conference, and then read Klaus's diary and see this is exactly how this event translated into the life of one individual person. Here's one country, here's another country, here's another country, and here is why these doors are closed at every turn, or why there is a challenge at every turn. One of the things that is a fairly ambitious thing to do, but if you have the time to do it, it can be a great exercise, is to get your students into pairs or into threes and ask them each to take a country from this list that Klaus has in his diary entry and research the immigration policy for Jews in the war. And then in the 1930s, rather, and then have them all come back and report on what the paperwork was, what the quotas were, and how it worked if you wanted to get in. And when you have a group of students who then, there are 10 countries, and you start to see every place is different, every place has its rules, it starts to really drive home this thing of like, there was no just leaving. There was, a desperate attempt to leave, and there was being met by restriction after restriction after restriction, kind of on every, from every turn. And it's super important, both in terms of understanding that moment, but also in making the larger point that the anti-Semitism that resulted in the Holocaust was not limited to Nazi Germany. It was also operative in all of these other countries where they didn't want Jews either. And, why is that? Because there was this deep belief that if Jews come into the country, they're going to bring with them these nefarious, aims to take over and to control, or to poison the society, or to, whatever the particular trope may be. So what else? What's another thing? So that was great. Thank you, Stephen. What's another, what's something else that jumped out?
Hey, Alex, I think one of the things that always jumps out at me is that comment he makes about his rich uncle in America.
The greatest.
And
yeah,
I don't know. Is he really rich? I don't know. But that one always stands out.
Yeah, so that's a great one to point out. And kids usually, they go right there. What I'd love to say about this, and I'm going to want to read I'll save the chat after so I can read all of your comments when I have a little more time. But the great thing about that phrase about the rich uncle is that it is a way. So now we've talked about the big picture, right? The Evian conference and all the countries. And then this is a way that you can zero in on America, and a point of entry for talking about what was actually happening in America and what might be meant by that sentence. Okay, so Klaus says the rich uncle in America is unable to assume such a financial responsibility. What's the implication there? Anybody want to, what's the implication on Klaus's part?
That he won't help at all.
Right. That he's selfish, doesn't want to bring them in, that he's selfish, that he's, uncaring, that, he's rich and he's hoarding his money, or they don't want to get involved. Exactly. But then you can ask your students, like I'm going to ask you, what's happening in America at this particular moment in 1938? What's going on in America economically? Right. It's the Great Depression. So the Great Depression. Is the uncle really rich? So here are the realm of possibilities now that we can begin to bring into this mix. Okay. Maybe the uncle was rich and he lost all his money in the Depression. Maybe the uncle was never really rich, but that's a sort of trope about Americans, that the rich American, the rich uncle in America, because he lives in America, the land of, the streets are paved in gold, and so he must be rich. It also could be that the uncle has a bad relationship with the father. It could be an interpersonal thing. There could be any number of reasons why this uncle is not able to support the family. But for Klaus, in this moment, the way that he says it is this little dig. right? The rich uncle in America. But it's incumbent upon us, and it's an opportunity for you as teachers to talk about what's really going on in America, not only the depression and the economic strain, but also the resistance to having Jews. And Meredith Howell has now said the thing that I always hope that somebody will say, is there a possibility that, quote, the rich uncle is a term for the worldview of the US as an overall rich country that isn't to be bothered? Yes. I mean, one student once said to me, could that be Uncle Sam? Is this a coded way of saying that America doesn't want us? It could be. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but it works as an interpretation. And you certainly could write a very good essay about why that's what that means, even if that's not what Klaus actually meant, if that makes sense. So what else? There's one other thing that I want to get at.
I don't know if I'd say it jumped off the page at me, but it made me think about the children I teach and just their lives. Oh, I'm going home to play video games, I'm babysitting, and just like that this boy's adolescence is like being torn from him with this fear and desperation and this time.
Yes, I think that's right. And the sense of responsibility. So what happens in the diary is that this is about his parents' immigration efforts. And then there's also Klaus's immigration efforts, which are not always aligned. At a certain point, he kind of goes off in another direction. There are opportunities that are open to him that are not open to them. So he's tracking both his own efforts to emigrate, and he's doing a lot of things to try to find a path out, and also following what is happening with his parents. So as you're saying, he's burdened with this tremendous responsibility and this tremendous fear about what is going to happen. And that only escalates as the diary goes on. Jessica Mills wrote, he seems stoic and writes as an older individual, but in hardships where there are so many obstacles, many shut their emotions off in order to make decisions and to make it through each day. Many of my students would be able to relate to the matter-of-fact way of his writing where he leaves his feelings out of it. So that's true. Klaus was someone who, at least at this point in the diary, is very matter-of-fact, not very emotional, definitely kind of stating the facts as they are and kind of reporting on his circumstances. Things get a little more heated as the diary goes on, and he becomes, it gets closer and closer to the outbreak of war, and the stakes grow higher and higher and higher. The other thing that I just wanted to call your attention to is the reference to Shanghai. So some of you may have noticed that he says, Shanghai also accepts Jews even without a visa, but it is questionable how one can live there. So one of the things that I think is really important to get into, if you're really going to look at the story of emigration efforts and how young people wrote about them in their diary, is to, and your young students who are themselves recent immigrants to this country or refugees may be able to speak to this in some cases. There are the outward obstacles that we've been talking about, right? How are you getting out? Who's taking you? How are you navigating? What are the circumstances? What are the geopolitical kind of circumstances that you have to navigate? But there also is a very deep internal set of beliefs that people have to grapple with when they are faced with a situation like this. When is the moment where you understand that the entitlements that you thought were yours are not yours anymore? That you are no longer an equal citizen in this society, and that as painful as it will be to give up everything that you know, and as terrifying as it will be to leave, that your chance of survival depends on that. And that moment is what that one line where he says, Shanghai also accepts Jews even without a visa, but it is questionable how one can live there, is so interesting, because knowing what we know now, when he says Shanghai accepts Jews without a visa, you would think, well, that's it. That's the answer to your question. Just go to Shanghai. Done. What's the problem? But we have to think about, first of all, what's happening in Shanghai. There's a war with China and Japan, right? It's very unstable. No one knows what's going to happen there. But also for Klaus and his family, as assimilated, very German feeling people who've always understood themselves as, you know, upstanding members of this society, to imagine that you had fallen so far that you were going to flee to a language, to a country where was so distant and different from Germany, where you didn't know the language and you didn't know how you were going to manage, and there were no Jews there, and it's so alien and different to everything that you've ever known. That voyage that one has to travel from an interior standpoint is also part of the story. And that little entry sort of gives us a little bit of a, you know, window into that. That's right. It would be exactly. It would be like us moving to Ukraine right now because we feel unsafe. Like, exactly how unsafe would you have to feel to do that? How, and we want to believe that we're exaggerating. We want to believe that things will go back to normal. We want to believe that, you know, we haven't lost our right to live in our native country as citizens. And that recognition came at different times in different ways for different people. And for many, many, many people, it came too late. And part of what our students need to understand is that it's easy to say it now, but at the time, 1937, 1938, you know, Auschwitz didn't exist. The final solution had not been conceived. The universe of possibility for these Jews did not include mass genocide. Had they known, obviously they would have made a different choice, but they were operating within the limits of what they know now. And that's, again, goes back to this thing of, why didn't they just leave? You know, and sort of reminding your students, you have to scroll back in your mind and imagine viewing the circumstances from that vantage point, not with what you know now. That's how we develop a kind of historical empathy for people in the past, and the idea that, you know, we can learn something about their experiences, not by imposing what we already know, but trying to understand what they were grappling with in their own time. Does that make sense? Okay. So is there any other? Yes, Nanking, exactly. Thank you. Is an example of the atrocities going on in China during the war. That's right. And there were people who did. There were people who went to Shanghai and they had a very difficult time, but they survived. You know, so, you know, that, but, you know, nobody knows in that moment what the right answer is going to be. And you make your best decision that you can. You know, and then sometimes it turns out and sometimes it doesn't. Right. Rumors of places to go and then never hearing about them again. Yeah. So, and that's another thing, is that, you know, in this context, there's also endless changing information, and the regulations are changing, and there are rumors, and people are saying you should do this and you should do that. And there are huge lines, and there, you know, I mean, it really is a, you know, it's very sobering, because we are certainly living in a time right now, I think, where, you know, we're seeing how fragile our democracy can be. And that is what is standing between us and chaos. And this is an object lesson. You know, what happens when that civil society begins to break down and people are navigating their way out of it as best they can. And some people are going to navigate their way out of it and get lucky. And of course, some people are not. So it's already 8 o'clock. This is what always happens with Klaus's diary. It's why I'm so glad that that you all chose to use it in your curriculum, because this is one entry, you know, and you could talk about it for an hour, and it's so incredibly rich and powerful. And the rest of the text is just more and more of that. So Oh yeah. Oh, thank you. Another interesting and important point, that our students, we all live in such an information rich world with instant news. It's hard for our students to realize that news did not travel fast. Right. I mean, news didn't travel fast. And also, let's just talk about for 1 second trying to navigate this by letter, by mail, no email, no Google. You can't look up like what's happening in Shanghai, you know, which I find when I talk to students, which, isn't that often, but when I do, and I try to make that point about technology, like their heads like roll back in their eyes roll back in their head. Like they cannot conceive of just how cumbersome and laborious. And one of the things that's great about Klaus's diary is that you get that sense of how labor intensive this was, how long it took, and the running physically from office to office. Yeah. How can people survive without cell phones and texting? Yeah. It was, in retrospect, it's looking pretty good. Yeah. Right. Okay, so we're not going to have time to do another close read right now because I'm looking at the time, and I want to share some Salvaged Pages resources with you and some other things. And I also want to make sure I leave time for questions and leave time for Lori to say something at the end. But that exercise that we just did, I just want to point out, you can do that with almost any diary entry in this book. I mean, one of the things about Salvaged Pages that I think turns out to make it very useful for teachers is that, I think this is your word, Lori, it's chunkable. You can take a chunk, take a diary entry, and you can lay it alongside something else that you're doing in your class. You don't need to be the world's leading expert. You don't need to, have spent 25 years on it. You can take a diary entry that, from a content standpoint, connects, and you can just give your students an opportunity to hear a young person's perspective on the history that you're teaching. And you can engage them in conversation. What jumps out at you? What do you notice? What's interesting? And you, as the teacher, may do what I did, which is you may know enough to direct that conversation. But if you don't, there's also a perfectly acceptable response, which is, let's find out. Let me find out. I'm going to find out the answer to that question and get back to you tomorrow. Or I want you to research that and come back and tell me what answer you found to your question. The point being, I think what I hope the takeaway is for you is that this material is very approachable and it is very useful and usable. And if for the first 3 years that you use it, all you do is use one diary entry in your lesson, that's great. And you may find that over time that grows and you use a whole diary or you use the whole book. But if not, that's okay too. I think it's really something that can be adapted to whatever it is that you're already doing in your classroom. So with that, I'm going to just briefly share my screen again. And I'm going to show you my website, which has a lot of resources that hopefully will be useful for you. So this is my author website, and it includes things outside of Salvaged Pages, but the version of the book that is in print and the most complete version is this second edition of the book. There's also a multimedia edition, which contains, and you can watch the trailer if you want to. It's this version, which only lives in a digital form, has a lot of visual material. It has images of the diaries, images of the writers, maps, artwork that the writers sometimes kept in their journals. There are short interview clips. There's interviews with me talking about different diary entries, doing kind of close readings, just like the one that I did just now with you. So it includes a lot of supplemental material, and sometimes teachers can find it helpful to just have one version of that you can project in your classroom, so that if your students want to see what did Klaus look like, or some pictures of him and his family, or what did the diary look like, or where's the map of where he went? Because, for example, Klaus eventually got out and went to Palestine. And so there's a map that shows the path that he took, and what happened to his parents and a letter that his father wrote him, for example, after the war. That's something that surfaced well after the first edition of Salvaged Pages came out. So that's something that I would say is sort of optional, but can be very rich. And not every student can handle words upon words upon words. You know, some of them need that point of entry, something visual, something that will give them a little bit of purchase to get into the text. We also have, of course, our documentary film, which is a 45-minute documentary based on Salvaged Pages. It was made by MTV. It is, for the most part, I think, a useful overview. There are things about it that I don't like. There are, I will warn you, a couple of pretty graphic moments in it. What's so interesting, because in 2005, when we made this film and when it aired on MTV, nobody even, I mean, we did have a conversation about it, but you know, nobody said, don't do that. And times have changed so much that now in 2023 or 2024, if you were making a documentary for classroom use, you would never include this, you know, very graphic footage of killing and hangings and that kind of thing. So I would just say, I think for older high school students, it's fine, but I would really advise you to watch the whole film. And some people may want to just take sections and show parts of it, and not show the whole film. That's really up to you and the kind of you know, what the culture is of your school. And then finally, there are a lot of educational resources. Some of them are not currently available. I am working on that. There's a great set of lessons for Salvaged Pages for each diary that are organized by history and literature. But Facing History and Ourselves is revamping their whole website. And so these resources are not available right now, but I am working on getting them up on my website. So that's something that I hope will happen within the next few months. The one thing that I will show you is this. This is like a little cheat sheet. If you want to use Salvaged Pages, but you know, don't really know where to start, I created this a long time ago, and it's just a way of just kind of mapping some entries that might be useful for you. So for example, you can look at the themes and topics like, okay, I'm interested in corruption and inequity. Here are a couple of diary entries that you might look at, or moral and ethical complexity, deportations, intellectual life, hope and despair. And it says where the kind of wartime experience, is it refugee, is it ghetto, is it hiding, what the subject is, the entry date, and where it can be found. So this is your best sort of cheat sheet for the book. If you're not using exactly what is provided in the curriculum for North Carolina and you want to go a little deeper, but you don't have the time to actually read through the book and, you know, find something, this might give you a little bit of wayfinding. And there also is a teacher's guide to I'm Still Here, which is our documentary. There are a couple of lectures that I've given, podcast, other things that you're welcome to look at, and you may find them useful for your classroom. So I want to just briefly mention this project. It's called Dispatches from Quarantine. It's something that I did during the pandemic. It was an effort to see if we could solicit diary entries by young people about their experiences in COVID-19, in the shutdown. And it was a really, it was sort of a proof of concept for something that, like the archive that I mentioned earlier, something that I'd really like to do someday, which is to create a journal, a youth journaling platform, to really kind of encourage young people to document their days in a very mindful way across a broad range of experiences. So we just wanted to just sort of see, like, if we threw out this idea, we shared diary entries and we had some prompts, would kids want to send us accounts of their daily lives? And so there was a piece on Morning Edition about it, which you can listen to, that's, you know, I think 6 or 7 minutes long, that includes, you know, sort of an overview of the whole story. And then on the website, there is this dispatches gallery. So each of these represents an entry of a teenager writing about their lives in quarantine. And, it's just something that you might find interesting. It's something that might inspire you to do something with your students. Your students might be interested to look back on these and reflect on them. I don't know exactly how it will be useful, but it is here, and I wanted to share it with you. And then finally, I want to take a minute to just mention one of my other lives. I have several lives as a writer and an educator. A lot of what I do is around Salvaged Pages and around continuing to teach this material and find new ways to bring it to students and teachers. I also continue to write new things. And I work part-time as the education director for the Defiant Requiem Foundation, which is an organization that some of you may know and some of you may not. It is an organization that tells the story of cultural resistance in the Terezin camp outside of Prague during the Holocaust. It's about a group of prisoners who were taught to sing the Verdi Requiem Mass by a Jewish conductor called Raphael Schechter. And it's an amazing story. And there's a beautiful documentary film that has been adapted to classroom length, 45 minutes. And then we have lessons that we've created, short modules for social studies, sort of an overview, one that's about propaganda and deception, which is a particularly interesting topic to be taking on right now, because the whole idea of truth and what is truth and how do we understand the truth and how is truth manipulated and for what purposes and for what ends is so much in the air right now. Then we have a wonderful lesson for ELA teachers on the rhetoric of the Requiem, which is really about looking at the libretto in 3 different contexts and thinking about how the same words mean different things, depending on who's saying them and in what context they're being said or sung. And then the fourth one is about the arts and creativity. And this one has something in it that I love very much, which is we have a series of, this always happens to me when you do have to register for these lessons if you want access to them, unless you want to cheat and use the password that you just saw me put in. We have these short videos that are about cultural resistance in other places and times. In particular, this one, The Banksy of Syria, is amazing, but Hula is More Than a Dance is also really wonderful. And so it's a way to start thinking about the idea of cultural resistance in the Holocaust and in other times, oppressive times, and by other groups of people. And so the last thing I'm going to just say is to kind of bring it back to Salvaged Pages is that I really view writing and journal writing as a form of resistance in this context. That anything that Jewish victims did, or any victims for that matter, did to declare their personhood, insist upon their humanity, resist the way in which they were being viewed and being made to suffer by this oppressive force, that is a form of resistance. Some people did it by making art. Some people did it by making music. Some people resisted by picking up a gun. Some people resisted by writing themselves into existence on the page. And I believe that for our young people, it's very important to really broaden that understanding of what constitutes resistance against an oppressive force. Because I think that it's very easy to think the only kind of resistance that matters is, shooting somebody or is taking somebody out, but that's not always the case. There are sometimes, these journals that these young writers kept, they remain to this day, and they give us a window into this past that we would not have if these writers had not picked up a pen or picked up a pencil and labored to describe their lives on the page. So with that, I think I'm happy to answer a few more questions. Let's see. Do you want to, Lori, do you want to, yeah,
I
I was
think
seeing
I
some
think
people.
a number of them were answered by everything you just went through.
Okay.
But we do have one asking about the diary of Eva Heyman, and whether there's still doubt about the authorship of the diary and any kind of controversies about that.
Yeah. So there is very considerable doubt about the authenticity of the diary. And actually somebody recently wrote a paper on it that I just recently read. I think this consensus among scholars is that it's very interesting to me because when I was doing the research on Salvaged Pages, I wrote about this in the book. I mean, I did not think that diary was authentic. It just doesn't sound, when you read enough diaries and you read that diary, it doesn't sound real. It doesn't sound like how kids really wrote about their lives, even taking into account the different ways in which young people wrote. So I have for a long time believed that because of the circumstances, for those of you who don't know, Eva Heyman was writing in a ghetto, Nagyvárad in Hungary. Her mother and stepfather escaped the ghetto and survived. Eva was deported to Auschwitz and was murdered. And after the war, her mother's husband was a writer. Her mother published this edition of the diary, but the original diary disappeared. And so the combination, and then her mother eventually committed suicide with clutching a picture of her daughter. The combination of her mother's sort of culpability for having abandoned her daughter and the dubious text of the diary itself, and the fact that the original manuscript is lost, all those circumstances combined really make a lot of people skeptical. I've always thought Ava probably kept some kind, maybe she kept some kind of diary, but that her mother embellished it enough that it would be something that could be published in order to preserve the memory of her child. But there are some scholars who think that it was completely invented from whole cloth. So all that is by way of saying, I wouldn't teach that one. There are a lot of others that you can use, and that one is I think a little bit it's problematic enough that it's best to stay away from it.
Okay, awesome. I don't see any other questions necessarily.
Great. Well,
So
it's kind of good timing because I think that you wanted to say
Mhm.
some things about what's going on in North Carolina.
yes, we do. We are very excited about all kinds of things going on here in North Carolina with Holocaust education, and the Giselle Abramson Holocaust Education Act, which we have actually released curriculum resources for ELA, and social studies is coming soon. We're finishing up with the graphic designer, and that should be on our website soon as well. But we also, of course, have the 7th grade text set for ELA that is a full unit plan all around Klaus Langer's diary. And of course, you've seen tonight how I can use excerpts from Salvaged Pages. And we really think that this particular text can be used by social studies teachers, by ELA teachers, any teacher actually who really is going to be taking just small chunks of it and inserting it into their lessons. So we hope that you found that valuable as well. Also, we have coming up in the spring on March 22nd, we will actually have Alex with us in person at Elon University. And we are just now releasing that registration link, and I'll be sending you an email to follow up with this webinar with that link. And perhaps actually, I think I have it right here. I'm sending you also in the chat the link to the text set for Salvaged Pages. And we'll also include the registration link for the workshop if you want to be one of the first to actually apply for that. Getting all my buttons right here. There's too many screens going on in my life.
Oh yeah.
There you go. All right. So we have all of those things going on, and we do have training from North Carolina Department of Public Instruction that will be announced very soon to help all the counties learn how to implement curriculum resources in their classrooms. So there are many things going on. We hope you stay connected with us. Excuse me. And if there's anything about this webinar, for example, that you want to use even with your students, looking at Klaus Langer or just background to the diary, we'll actually have this video uploaded on our YouTube channel within the next couple of days. Excuse me. So, it kind of final words, if you're a teacher and you would like to receive continuing education credits for attending the webinar tonight, I put a link to the evaluation instrument in the chat. Just click on that, fill that out, and it might take us a week or two to get you the certificate because there's a lot of you, but we'll get it to you. And you can submit it in your own county for continuing education credits. But we really hope that you come and join us on March 22nd, which is the in-person date, full day workshop. Substitutes are paid for. And we'll also have a Holocaust survivor there speaking. So I think it's going to be a very, very interesting day, and we hope that you join us.
Yeah, I'd love to see you all there. We'll definitely get to read some more diary entries and do more back and forth in person, close reading together. So some of it would, of course, be what you've heard, but some of it will be new. So I'd love to see some of you there.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for having me, Lori. Thanks,
Yes.
Lee, and Mike, and everyone. I really appreciate it. And Karen and Amy. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for attending. We hope you have a good night. Thank you, Alex. We'll be talking soon. And
Thank you, Alex. Thank you.
Thanks
right.
so much.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Alex and
everybody.
everyone. Appreciate it.
All right. Bye.